A fugitive's last request before execution. But what happens in the execution chamber shocks everyone. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback is crucial. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The room was cold that morning, with white walls reflecting the artificial light almost aggressively. The 30-year-old woman sat still, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the faces around her. Everyone avoided her gaze, as if mere proximity could taint their clear consciences. She knew this was the end, that all attempts to explain her side had been ignored, dismissed as the lies of someone trying to escape the consequences. Her heart was racing, but it wasn't the fear of what was to come that tormented her. It was the thought that she would never again see those big, scared eyes, that shy smile she had learned to earn with so much effort over the past few months. The 30-year-old cop stood near the door, his rigid posture trying to hide the discomfort he felt. He had been assigned to oversee this final procedure, a responsibility that usually wouldn't cause him hesitation. But this case was different. Something inside him screamed that pieces were missing, that the truth hadn't been fully revealed. His eyes met the woman's for a brief moment, and he saw there not the coldness of a criminal, but the despair of someone who had lost everything. That's when she made the request. Her voice came out hoarse, broken by contained emotion. She wanted to see the 4-year-old girl, the child she had found abandoned, the little one who seemed only 2 years old when she discovered her, fragile as an injured bird in that vacant lot. The request caused immediate confusion. People exchanged incredulous glances, whispering to each other. Why would someone convicted of embezzlement and kidnapping want to see the child she supposedly abducted? The cop frowned, his mind working quickly to understand the situation. He knew details of the case that hadn't been fully explored during the trial, inconsistencies that bothered him in the quiet hours of the night. Months earlier, the woman's life followed a monotonous and predictable rhythm. She woke up before dawn, took 2 buses to get to the hospital in the neighboring town where she worked as a cleaning lady. Her hands knew every corridor, every room, every corner of that place that smelled eternally of disinfectant and worry. She had no close friends, didn't participate in the lively conversations during breaks, didn't share details of her personal life. She preferred silence, the invisibility that her job provided. It was safer that way, simpler. The change happened on a rainy afternoon as she returned to the small apartment she rented on the outskirts of town. The path included passing through a vacant lot covered in tall grass and accumulated trash, a place she always avoided looking directly at. But that day, a faint sound caught her attention. It was a cry, so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. She stopped, her body tense, as she tried to identify where the sound was coming from. She walked towards the lot, her shoes sinking into the mud, until she saw the cardboard box soaked, half destroyed by the water. Inside was the girl. Her enormous eyes watched her with a mixture of fear and silent supplication. The child was dirty, her skin cold to the touch, trembling violently. Her clothes were ill-fitting rags, and there were marks on her body that indicated severe neglect. The woman felt something break inside her, a pain so intense that for a moment she couldn't move. Then, without thinking about the consequences, she picked up the child in her arms and ran home. The following weeks were a mixture of constant care and growing worry. The woman cleaned the girl with warm water, dressed her in makeshift clothes, fed her small portions that her fragile stomach could process. She bought basic medicines with the little money she had, treated the superficial wounds, stayed awake all night, watching the child's irregular breathing. Slowly, very slowly, the girl began to improve. Her cheeks gained a little color. Her eyes lost some of that glazed look of someone who had given up on living. But the woman knew she was in an impossible situation. She had no documents to prove the child's origin, no resources for a formal adoption process, no financial stability to convince the authorities that she would be a suitable mother. Her apartment was tiny, Her salary barely covered her own expenses, and now there was an extra mouth to feed. Even so, she couldn't imagine handing that child over to the system, not after seeing the state in which she was abandoned. Who would guarantee that the girl wouldn't go back to the person who had left her that way, who would care enough to protect her? The girl began to cling to her intensely. She cried when she left for work, waited anxiously for her return, followed her footsteps around the small apartment. She created a loving nickname for the woman, an invented word that had meaning only for the two of them. The nights became precious moments when the woman held the child against her chest and sang softly, feeling the small heart beat against hers. Meanwhile, something was happening at the farmers' co-op, where she had worked briefly months before. The institution was the economic heart of the rural community, responsible for organizing the collective sale of products from the small farmers in the region. When funds began to disappear, the news spread like wildfire, causing panic and distrust among the families who depended on that income. The treasurer, a 60-year-old woman respected by all, was immediately placed under suspicion. She had dedicated decades to the work, always demonstrating impeccable honesty, but the evidence seemed to point in her direction. The cop was assigned to investigate the case. He was known for his dedication and sharp instinct, qualities that made him respected in the force. When examining the records, he noticed something strange. In the months before the disappearance of the funds, there were several small irregularities that had gone unnoticed, and there was a curious note in the employee file about the abrupt dismissal of a cleaning lady, with no clear reason recorded. When he investigated further, he discovered that the cleaning lady was the 30-year-old woman who now lived alone on the outskirts of town. He tried to locate her for a routine interrogation, just to clarify some details about the period she worked at the co-op. But when he showed up at her apartment door, she panicked. Her eyes widened. She glanced quickly inside the apartment where the girl was hidden, and then fled out the back exit. The cop was perplexed by the reaction. Why would someone innocent run away from a simple interrogation? The suspicion that was once just a formality turned into something more serious. He didn't know that in that apartment there was a child that the woman was desperately trying to protect, nor that the flight was not out of guilt, but out of fear that they would discover her irregular situation and take the girl away from her. The search warrant was issued, and the woman officially became a fugitive. The escape began chaotically and desperately. The woman took only the essentials, some clothes, the little money she had saved, basic documents, and the backpack with the girl's belongings. They left through the back door, while the cop was still knocking on the front, running through the narrow alleys until they reached the road that led out of town. The child, frightened by the sudden rush, cried softly against her shoulder, not understanding why they were running. The woman whispered reassuring words as she walked as fast as she could, her lungs burning with the effort. They spent the first night in an abandoned barn, miles away from town. The place smelled of old hay and damp wood, but offered protection from the cold wind that blew strongly at that time of year. The woman made a makeshift bed with her coat, laid the girl down, and stayed awake all night, watching every shadow, every strange sound. Her body was tense, prepared to flee again at any moment. She couldn't stop thinking about the cop's confused look when she ran. She knew that reaction had made everything worse, that now she seemed truly guilty of something terrible. The following days turned into an exhausting routine of constant movement. They slept where they could, cautiously accepted help from strangers who showed compassion, ate what came their way. The woman worked in exchange for food on some isolated farms, always using false names, always avoiding questions about the child. The girl, little by little, was adapting to that nomadic life. She learned to be quiet when necessary, not to ask questions about the reason for the constant flight, but her enormous eyes watched everything with a sadness that broke the woman's heart. During this period, the woman began to discreetly investigate the girl's origin. She visited small communities in the surrounding area, talked to people at local markets, asked careful questions about missing children, but no one seemed to know anything. It was as if that child had come from nowhere, without a past, without a family looking for her. The woman didn't understand how this was possible. How could a child simply disappear without anyone doing anything? With each passing day, her determination to protect the girl grew, even if it cost her own freedom. The girl began to talk more during the escape. Single words at first, then short sentences. She called the woman by that loving nickname she had invented, and sometimes said things that revealed disturbing fragments of her past. One night, upon seeing a tall man pass near the place where they were hiding, the child cowered, trembling violently. She whispered something about a dark place, about loud voices yelling, about hunger that ached in her stomach for days. The woman held the girl tightly, her own tears wetting the child's hair. She swore to herself that she would do anything, pay any price, to ensure that child never went back to wherever she had come from. Meanwhile, the cop's investigation was taking unexpected turns. He had assembled a complete picture of the co-op's financial transactions, and something didn't fit. The suspicious withdrawals had begun exactly 3 days after the cleaning lady's dismissal, but the amounts were too large for her to have access to. Furthermore, she had no technical knowledge or authorization to tamper with the financial systems. He began to re-interview the co-op employees, asking more specific questions about who had real access to the funds. That's when the treasurer's son's name came up for the first time. An employee casually mentioned that the 30-year-old had helped his mother with some accounting tasks in the previous months, as he had experience in the area. No one had considered this relevant before, because he wasn't an official employee. He just provided sporadic help. The cop investigated the young man's history and discovered something concerning. He had considerable debts, resulting from bets on illegal games that took place in the area. The debts had increased dramatically in the months prior to the disappearance of the funds. The cop tried to locate the treasurer's son for a conversation, but discovered that he had left town shortly after the woman's trial, claiming to have found work in another region. This raised red flags in the investigator's mind. Why would someone leave the area just when their mother was being investigated? He began to review all the documents of the case with new eyes, looking for connections he had missed before. The pressure on the fugitive woman increased every day. Posters with her photo were distributed throughout the region. Alerts were sent to all nearby police stations. The cop led the searches personally, but now with a different motivation. He no longer just wanted to arrest her. He wanted to understand her story, find out why she had reacted in such an extreme way. There was something about that case that didn't make sense, and his intuition told him that the truth was much more complex than it seemed. One afternoon, after almost 5 months on the run, the woman made a mistake. She had taken the girl to a fair in a small town, desperately needing to buy medicine because the child had a high fever. A local resident recognized her face from the posters and discreetly called the authorities. When she noticed the strange movement around her, she tried to quickly leave the fair, but it was too late. Police officers surrounded the area, and there was nowhere to run with a feverish child in her arms. The scene of the capture was painful. The girl, even sick, sensed the danger and began to scream, clinging to the woman's neck with desperate force. She cried uncontrollably, repeating the loving nickname between sobs, begging not to be separated from the only person who had shown her love. The woman tried to calm her, but her own voice was broken by emotion. She knew this was the end, that there would be no more chances to escape. When the officers tried to separate the child from her, the girl fought with all the strength her small body allowed, scratching, kicking, screaming in a way that made many of those present look away. The cop arrived at the scene shortly after. He watched the scene and felt something tighten in his chest. There was something deeply wrong there. That wasn't the reaction of a kidnapper and her victim. It was the despair of a mother and daughter being torn from each other. He saw in the woman's eyes not the coldness of a criminal, but the absolute love of someone who had sacrificed everything for that child. And he saw in the girl's eyes not the fear of her captor, but the terror of losing her protector. The girl was taken to a temporary shelter while her true identity was investigated. She spent the first few days screaming, refusing food, crying non-stop. The social workers were worried about the extreme behavior. They had never seen a child so attached to someone who supposedly kidnapped her. The woman, in turn, was formally charged not only for her alleged involvement in the farmer's co-op embezzlement, but also for the kidnapping of a minor. The evidence seemed overwhelming against her. During the interrogations, she maintained her story. She had found the girl abandoned and tried to protect her, but when asked why she didn't seek out the authorities immediately, she couldn't give an answer that seemed rational. How to explain the fear that they would take the child away from her? How to make them understand that she had seen in that girl's eyes something that convinced her that returning her to the system would be condemning her to suffering again? Her explanations sounded like weak excuses, and the jury, made up of conservative members of the community, had no doubts in convicting her. The sentence was severe. The date was set, and the woman was taken to a small cell where she would spend her last months. She received paper and pen and spent every available hour writing everything about the girl. Her favorite foods, the songs that made her smile, the fears that woke her up at night, the affectionate gestures she had learned. She wrote frantically, desperate to leave a record that could help someone take care of that child the way she deserved. But deep down, she knew that no one would love the girl as she loved her. No one would understand her silent needs as she had learned to understand. In that cold cell, as she counted the days that remained, the woman didn't know that the cop was discovering the truth that would change everything. The cop hadn't been able to sleep properly since the trial. Every night, he mentally reviewed the details of the case, looking for what he had missed. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by piles of documents, he went through each testimony again, each financial record, each small note that might have been overlooked. There was something there, hidden in the fine print, waiting to be discovered. His colleagues had already lost interest in the case, considering it closed and resolved, but he couldn't let it go. It was during one of those sleepless nights that he found something disturbing. Hidden among the personal papers of the elderly treasurer, there was a letter she had started writing days before her sudden death. The words were shaky, written in the irregular handwriting of someone who was emotionally distraught. She mentioned deep regret, talked about silences she had kept out of maternal love, about impossible choices between protecting a son and doing what was right. The letter was never finished, but it was enough to raise serious questions. The cop intensified his investigation into the treasurer's son. He discovered that the young man had incurred debts with local loan sharks, dangerous people who had no patience with debtors. The records showed that he had made substantial payments on these debts, exactly in the period after the disappearance of the farmers' co-op funds. The dates lined up perfectly. Furthermore, witnesses began to remember seeing him at the co-op more often than they had initially stated, always alone in the office where the financial records were kept. When the cop tried to locate him for questioning, he discovered that the young man had disappeared completely. No one knew his current whereabouts, and he had left no contact address. His phone was turned off, his bank accounts inactive. It was the behavior of someone who had something to hide. The cop issued an alert to other regions, asking them to locate him for urgent interrogation. But weeks passed without news, and time was running out for the convicted woman. In parallel, the investigation into the girl's identity finally began to produce results. A social worker from the state capital recognized the child's description. She had been monitoring a case of child neglect months ago, involving a 30-year-old woman who lived in deplorable conditions with a young daughter. The social worker had visited the residence several times, documenting the lack of adequate food, the unsanitary conditions, the signs that the child was not receiving basic care. She was gathering evidence to officially remove the child when, suddenly, the girl disappeared. The biological mother had claimed that distant relatives had taken the child temporarily, but never provided specific details or documentation. The social worker was suspicious, but without concrete evidence of a crime and with an excessive caseload to manage, she couldn't follow up properly. The disappearance was formally recorded, but the case received low priority because the mother didn't seem particularly concerned about her daughter's absence. Now, months later, it became clear that the woman had simply abandoned the child in that vacant lot. When the cop confronted the biological mother with the new information, she initially denied everything. But under increasing pressure and in the face of the accumulating evidence, she finally admitted it. She said she could no longer take care of her daughter, that the child was a burden, that she had made a desperate decision. Her words were devoid of genuine remorse, focused only on justifying her own actions. The cop felt nauseous listening to her speak so coldly about her own daughter. He thought of the convicted woman who had risked everything to save that child, and the cruel irony that she was paying for a crime she never committed. Armed with this new information, the cop immediately went to his superiors, demanding the reopening of the case. But he met unexpected resistance. The trial had been public, the sentence had already been established, and admitting mistakes now would be embarrassing for the system. His superiors argued that even if the woman hadn't kidnapped the child in the legal sense, she had still kept a minor without proper authorization, and there was still the case of the farmer's co-op embezzlement not completely resolved. They suggested that he leave the case alone and focus on other responsibilities. But the cop couldn't do that. Not after seeing the genuine despair in the eyes of that woman and the child. He began to work in his spare time, gathering evidence almost obsessively. He tracked all the treasurer's son's bank transactions, obtained records of his conversations with loan sharks, documented every inconsistency in the original testimonies. He re-interviewed the co-op employees, asking more direct questions about the access the young man had to the financial systems. One of the older employees finally revealed something crucial. He had seen the woman, when she still worked as a cleaning lady, talking seriously with the elderly treasurer one afternoon, weeks before being fired. The conversation seemed tense, and he had overheard fragments about irregularities in the records. At the time, he didn't give it much importance, but now he remembered clearly. The woman had tried to report something she had noticed during her cleaning work, something that the treasurer clearly didn't want investigated. Days after that conversation, the cleaning lady was fired without explanation. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The woman had witnessed something compromising, probably seen documents or conversations that revealed the treasurer's son's scheme. The treasurer, torn between protecting her son and doing the right thing, chose to fire the woman to silence her. When the funds were eventually discovered to be missing, it was easy to direct suspicion to the fired cleaning lady who had mysteriously fled. The treasurer's son had orchestrated everything perfectly, using his mother's position of trust to access the funds and then ensuring that someone else took the blame. The cop presented all these findings again to his superiors, this time with evidence so solid that it couldn't be ignored. They reluctantly agreed to issue a warrant to locate the treasurer's son and bring him in for formal interrogation. But time was running out. The date set for the woman's final procedure was just days away, and the young man remained missing. Meanwhile, the woman lived her last days in the cell with a resigned calm. She had stopped writing her notes about the girl, accepting that there was nothing more she could do. Her hands trembled less now, replaced by an emotional numbness that protected her from total despair. She thought constantly about the child, imagining if she was eating properly, if someone was comforting her during the nightmares, if she still remembered the loving nickname they used. The pain of not knowing was almost physical, a constant pressure in her chest that never eased. The girl in the temporary shelter had stopped screaming but hadn't improved. She sat in the corner of the room, hugging a small teddy bear that someone had given her, refusing to interact with the other children. She ate only the bare minimum, slept poorly, and woke up crying every night. The social workers were concerned about her condition, discussing the need for specialized psychological intervention, but nothing they tried worked. The child had closed her heart to the world, lost in the absence of the only person who had shown her what it was to be loved. 2 days before the fatal date, the cop received the news he had been waiting for. The treasurer's son had been located in a coastal city, living under a false name and working in temporary jobs. When the local police approached him, he tried to flee, behavior that only confirmed his guilt. He was taken into custody and brought back to the region for interrogation. The cop conducted the interrogation personally. At first, the young man denied everything, maintaining a defensive posture and repeating that he knew nothing. But when confronted with the bank records, the testimonies of the witnesses, and the documentary evidence that the cop had meticulously gathered, his defense began to crumble. He realized there was no way out, that the truth was surrounding him on all sides. His hands began to tremble, sweat covered his forehead, and his voice lost its former firmness. That's when he confessed. The words came out in a desperate stream, as if he was relieved to finally share the weight he was carrying. He admitted to embezzling the farmer's co-op funds to pay off his gambling debts, using the access he had through his mother. He explained how he had manipulated the records to hide his actions, and how he had realized that the cleaning lady had noticed something strange. When she tried to report her suspicions to the treasurer, he convinced his mother to fire the woman immediately, claiming that she was causing problems. Then, when the funds were eventually discovered to be missing, it was simple to direct the investigation to the fired cleaning lady who had mysteriously fled. The cop recorded every word of the confession, ensuring that there was no doubt about its validity. He immediately prepared all the necessary documentation and ran to his superiors. It was the eve of the day scheduled for the woman's final procedure. There was no more time to lose. The morning arrived grey and cold, with heavy clouds covering the sky. The woman was awakened before dawn, her hands trembling as she put on the simple clothes they had provided her. She had no more tears to shed, just a deep emptiness that had replaced all other emotions. The guards led her through the silent corridors to the room where everything would be finalized. Each step seemed to weigh tons, each breath required conscious effort. She thought of the girl, imagined her face one last time, and whispered softly the loving nickname that only the two of them knew. When she arrived at the room, she saw the cop standing near the door, his expression tense and tired. He had spent the entire night trying to speed up the bureaucratic processes, making desperate calls, begging for an emergency stay. But the legal procedures were slow, and even with the confession of the real culprit in hand, the documents needed to officially cancel the procedure were still being processed. He looked at the woman, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't decipher. Was it pity, regret, or something else? The woman was positioned in the center of the room, surrounded by faces that avoided looking directly at her. The person in charge of the procedure checked the documents one last time, his monotonous voice reading established protocols. Everything was in order. Everything was proceeding as planned. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of papers being handled and held breaths. That's when the woman made her final request. Her voice came out hoarse but firm. She wanted to see the 4-year-old girl one last time. The request caused immediate confusion. Those present exchanged disconcerted glances, whispering to each other about the irregularity of the request. The person in charge frowned, arguing that there was no precedent for such a thing, that it was highly unusual. But the cop intervened, his firm voice breaking through the objections. He insisted that the request be granted, using his authority and the urgency of the situation to pressure them. After minutes of tense deliberation, they reluctantly agreed. The girl was brought from a nearby building where she was waiting under temporary supervision. When she entered the room, her big, scared eyes scanned the environment until she found the woman. For a second that seemed eternal, they just looked at each other. Then the child let out a sharp cry and ran, her short legs moving as fast as they could. She threw herself into the woman's arms with full force, clinging as if her life depended on it, repeating the loving nickname between desperate sobs. The woman held her against her chest, her own tears finally falling freely. She kissed the girl's head repeatedly, whispering words of love and comfort. The child buried her face in her neck, trembling violently, her small hands gripping the woman's clothes tightly. Everyone in the room was paralyzed, witnessing that demonstration of absolute love. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the scene. Others felt their own tears threatening to escape. The cop watched everything with a heavy heart. He knew the truth now, knew that woman was innocent, that she had sacrificed everything for that child. He checked his phone for the 10th time that minute, desperately waiting for the official confirmation that would authorize the immediate stay. But the screen remained blank, with no new messages. His stomach churned with anxiety, his hands were sweating as he squeezed the device tightly. The woman whispered in the girl's ear, telling her to be strong, not to forget that she was loved, to grow up knowing that someone had fought for her until the end. The child shook her head frantically, refusing to accept that this would be a goodbye. She repeated endlessly that she didn't want to be separated, that she wanted to stay together, that she was afraid of being alone again. Her words broke the hearts of all who heard them. The person in charge of the procedure looked at his watch, his expression showing that time was running out. He approached cautiously, starting to say that they needed to continue with the protocol. The girl sensed his intention and began to scream, clinging even tighter to the woman. The cop stepped forward, his voice coming out louder than he intended, asking for a few more minutes. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone trapped in that impossible moment. It was exactly at that instant that the cop's phone rang. The sound cut through the air like lightning, making everyone jump. He answered immediately, his face transforming as he heard the words on the other end of the line. His eyes widened, his breathing quickened, and then he shouted, "Stop! Stop everything now!" The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone looked at the cop, as if he had lost his mind. He moved to the center of the room, his phone still in his hand, explaining quickly that the real culprit had confessed completely. The treasurer's son was in custody, admitting to embezzling the farmers' co-op funds and falsely incriminating the woman who had tried to report him. The official order to cancel the procedure was being transmitted at that very moment. Those present were stunned, processing the bombshell information. The person in charge picked up his own phone, making urgent calls to confirm. Minutes that felt like hours passed as he spoke with various authorities, his expression changing from skeptical to shocked. When he finally hung up, he looked at the woman with a mixture of relief and horror, confirming that yes, a terrible mistake had occurred and that the procedure was officially cancelled. The woman could barely process what was happening. She continued to hold the girl, her body trembling uncontrollably as reality slowly penetrated her consciousness. It wasn't the end. She wouldn't be taken from that child. They would have more time together. She sobbed, a sound that mixed pain, relief, and absolute disbelief. The girl, feeling the change in the woman's energy, looked at her face, her big eyes trying to understand. The following days were a whirlwind of frenetic activity. The full investigation into the case was officially reopened, with higher authorities taking responsibility. The treasurer's son was formally charged with embezzlement, now facing serious consequences for his actions. He tried to argue in his defense, but the evidence was overwhelming, and his recorded confession sealed his fate. The community was shocked to discover the truth, many feeling ashamed for having judged the woman so quickly. The investigation into the girl also deepened. The biological mother was interrogated extensively about abandoning her daughter. She admitted to leaving the child in that vacant lot, claiming that she was unable to care for her and that she didn't know what to do. Her history of neglect was fully documented, including the several visits from the social worker who had recorded the deplorable conditions in which the girl lived. The court quickly determined that she had permanently lost any rights to the child, considering her actions not only negligent but criminal. The woman was completely exonerated of all charges. The system issued a formal apology, acknowledging the serious error that had been committed. She received financial compensation for the months of unjust suffering, an amount that, although it couldn't undo the pain experienced, would at least provide stability to rebuild her life. More importantly, she received official permission to begin the process of adopting the girl. The following months brought profound changes. The woman used part of the compensation to rent a small but cozy house on the outskirts of town, far from the tiny apartment where it had all begun. The house had 2 bedrooms, a backyard where the girl could play safely, and large windows that let the sunlight in abundantly. She decorated the child's room with soft and cheerful colors, filling it with simple toys and children's books that she bought little by little. The girl began attending a small community school. At first, she was extremely shy, hiding behind the woman whenever someone tried to approach her. But with time, endless patience, and the support of understanding teachers, she began to open up. She made her first friend, a quiet child like her, and gradually discovered the joy of playing with other children. Her laughter, rare at first, became more frequent, filling the house with a music that the woman never tired of hearing. The woman got a better job at a nearby medical clinic. The work was during school hours, allowing her to pick up the girl every day at the end of classes. Her new colleagues were welcoming, respecting her privacy but offering genuine friendship. She began to feel part of something bigger, no longer the invisible person who cleaned corridors in silence, but someone valued and respected for her skills and dedication. The cop became a frequent visitor. He had developed a sense of personal responsibility for the case, feeling that he needed to ensure that the woman and the girl were really okay. Over time, that responsibility turned into genuine friendship. He brought small gifts for the child, simple toys that made her smile, and talked at length with the woman about life, about new beginnings, about overcoming deep traumas. His presence became comforting, a reminder that not everyone had given up on her. The girl, with adequate therapy and constant love, began to overcome the traumas of the past. She still had occasional nightmares, waking up scared in the middle of the night, but now there was someone there to comfort her, to turn on the light and whisper that she was safe. Her physical signs of malnutrition disappeared completely, replaced by rosy cheeks and bright eyes. She grew not only physically but emotionally, discovering confidence she never knew she could have. In the garden of the house, they planted flowers together. The girl chose colorful seeds at the local market, her small hands digging holes in the ground with childlike enthusiasm. When the first flowers bloomed weeks later, she shouted with joy, running into the house to drag the woman to the garden. They stood there, side by side, admiring the vibrant petals that swayed gently in the breeze. The woman felt tears of happiness streaming down her face, tears so different from those she had shed in that cold cell months ago. The adoption was finally finalized in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. The woman held the girl's hand as the judge read the formal documents, declaring them officially mother and daughter in the eyes of the law. The child didn't fully understand the meaning of all those papers, but she understood what mattered. They were a family now, for real, forever. When they left the courthouse, the girl asked if that meant no one could ever separate them again. The woman knelt down in front of her, looking directly into her eyes, and promised that yes, they were together now and always would be. The seasons changed, bringing new challenges and small victories. The girl lost her first tooth and was fascinated by the idea of the tooth fairy. The woman left a coin under her pillow, and in the morning the child woke up with a smile so wide that it lit up the whole room. They had picnics in the park on Sundays, read stories before bed every night, celebrated every small milestone as if it were extraordinary, because for them it really was. The community, which had previously judged so quickly, now looked at them with renewed respect. Some apologized directly, admitting that they had rushed to conclusions. Others demonstrated regret through silent gestures of kindness. A neighbor who brought freshly baked cakes, a shopkeeper who always gave a special discount, a doctor who offered free consultations for the girl. These gestures, although they didn't undo the past, helped to build a gentler present. The cop implemented changes in the local justice system, working tirelessly to create protocols that would prevent future errors. He gave talks on the importance of thorough investigations, on not jumping to conclusions, on remembering that behind every case there were real lives being affected. His dedication inspired others, creating waves of change that spread throughout the region. One autumn afternoon, the woman and the girl were in the garden picking the flowers they had planted together. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The child held a small bouquet, her hands stained with dirt, her face radiant with simple happiness. She looked at the woman and said, with the particular seriousness of children, that she was the luckiest person in the world. The woman smiled, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes, and replied that no, she was the lucky one. At that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the flowers they had grown together under the sky that promised a new tomorrow, they were living proof that even after the deepest suffering, even when the darkness seems absolute, love can prevail. Their journeys had been painful, marked by injustices and losses, but they had found in each other something that no one could take away: the unwavering certainty that they belonged together and that together they could face anything the future brought. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.